Another good
Welcome
one.
to, I think it is the 9th episode in our European Union legal organization series, talking specifically about the defense of the European Union.
With pencils.
I am your co-host, Richard Sassoon, with our phenomenal European Union expert, Aaron De Los Reyes, and we have a few ground rules to set before we get into the fun business. This is not an academic presentation. Neither of us is, strictly speaking, accredited in the disciplines that we will be discussing, although we do have a lot of lay knowledge there. This presentation will try to address the European Union from a secular perspective, neither being Eurosceptic nor being strongly supportive of the European Union, talking about its strengths and weaknesses as we move through the period. We would like everybody to be respectful of the topic matter, but that said, we love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will ask Aaron those questions as time arises. We like to say that these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you know the information, this will be something that accentuates that. That's the 201. And if you don't know anything, don't worry. Aaron and I will catch you up. That's the 101. There will be a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that at 4 p.m. Eastern time, we will do no more slides and we will then just finish the Q&A. So you don't have to worry about missing anything if you have to leave after 2 hours. And like all the entries in the European Union series, as well as all the other series that are done by this group, you can find them on our YouTube page, our meetup page. Those links are in the chat. I will place them back in again at the end of 2 hours. And you can watch it later along with those. All right, so now to the part that we really care about, the common foreign security and international relations of the European Union until very recently. All right, Aaron.
Yep.
Take me where you want to take me.
Yeah, so the first couple slides, just quick review on the map. I think it's always important to do maps, especially in the modern world where people don't read maps or geography can be challenged. And especially, I think, in the most news and written and even higher end institutional material, you just don't see a lot of use of maps. So I want to spend a little bit of time on maps and just keep throwing them in throughout the series. But it's important to recognize that Europe and Central Asia as part of the Western Asian Peninsula, in essence, the scale of it and all the states that are involved that aren't part of West Europe or what's considered, Western Europe post World War II, and that enormous amount of the expansion of what Europe is or how it's defining itself is really from Central Eastern Europe and ultimately across parts of the Mediterranean and into Central Asia. So next slide real quick. And as a sort of a follow-on to this just gives you a sense of dates for different ascensions into the EU or countries that were part of the enlargement process during the 2000s. Now, obviously, Turkey is not part of that. Well, what's interesting is Turkey's in sort of this gray zone, right? So their application has never been pulled. They never pulled it. The EU has never, let's say, I forgot the technical word is, but
the European Union has never rescinded it.
Yes, exactly. They haven't rescinded so it's stuck in this sort of like suspense file that it's located in that, I think somewhere in that like 1.0 zone, because there was back then, I think there were 32 or 33 different directives you had to comply with to even formally actually begin the ascension process, not necessarily be even accepted. And I think Turkey was somewhere around 13 to 16 into that. So about halfway, let's say. And of course, they've added more directives. I think it's around 38 now, something like that, 37, 38. And eventually Turkey is an important thing and was something we'll talk about today because of the 2000s, which is the majority of what we're going to focus on today. So next slide real quick. So we'll do a quick run through of sort of the history of common European defense, Treaty of Dunkirk between the UK and France after World War II, the military Article 4 Treaty of Brussels, which included all the Benelux or the Benelux countries, the Western Union Defense Organization, which obviously became the evolution into the Western European Union, the WEU. And then obviously throughout the Cold War, there were all kinds of, let's say, small evolutions in common defense configurations, most of which went through NATO, but some of which for domestic reasons or the creation of defense industries were on a pure European basis. But then after the end of the Cold War, you could say there was a rejuvenation of the concept of a common European, at least defense and sort of the scaffolding or the skeletal structures. And so what was called the Petersburg Tasks, which were incorporated in the Amsterdam Treaty, which was very focused on humanitarian aid, peacekeeping, crisis management, because the crisis, as we all remember, in the 90s in Europe was, the former Yugoslavia and the breakup of it, and its civil war as the major crisis on the European continent. And then by the end of the 90s, the Cologne European Council, which was about folding in the WEU into the EU, because the EU had been formed, and then in essence constructing the next generation scaffolding, which is where we're sort of taking this to, the common foreign and security policy into the 2000s. Next slide. So there was further unification, and you can see on the map there. So who's an EU member, who's a NATO member only, who's a member of both. And obviously that's changing given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we're focused on, this sort of last 20-year history.
As a quick question on that,
please.
Has the Ukraine situation changed the position of Ireland or Austria with regards to NATO?
Fantastic question. Ireland is a very interesting case because of their historic focus on neutrality, and more importantly, as a anti-party to whatever UK policy is, going back obviously in the last century. So they still are, let's say, neutral plus. So they're like leaning. But the reality is Ireland is not configured as a military or really a defense state. So the things that they can offer really have more to do with humanitarian aid, peacekeeping, very, very much into the 90s sort of EU centric focus. And so I don't just seeing within Irish politics and people, which is very interesting given how intense domestically, reactions can be. I don't see them ever evolving into any kind of kinetic capacity, any type of real military capacity. I mean, so maybe everything surrounding that. Where it gets a little interesting is access to the Irish coast, exclusion zones, maritime security. I could see them developing a more robust Coast Guard, and ultimately, as a member of the EU and a member of the, let's say, larger European community security, the other European powers providing additional security along their coast, especially if there is a larger shift, which I would expect, in the Russian, more medium-term Russian defense posture, i.e. Newer generations of things like submarines, attack class, et cetera, where, that will obviously transform the maritime environment, which right now isn't a major focus except for the Black Sea. So I think for Ireland, that's a special case. Austria is, I would say, like neutral plus, like they're really moving, and they're and I think what's important is that Austria is during the Cold War, they were really a gray state because of the requirements of the Soviet Union in allowing Austria to, in essence, be independent. And so it was pretty clear that they had to stay extremely neutral. And obviously, they have a history during World War II, which wasn't neutral and was obviously pro-German ultimately. And then obviously the prior history is part of the Habsburgs and so on. And so I think in the end, Austria is figuring out, very much like Germany, obviously much smaller, where they're going to sit in this newer world. I would say they will be a lightweight military complement over time. They have some fantastic defense and security institutes that just developed because of all of the neutrality they had during the Cold War, especially the end of the Cold War. We can cover some of that more when we do our Ukrainian war update in the beginning of October. One thing we did talk about here is the concept of the Berlin Plus agreements. This was really given the fact that Germany, the unified Germany, is such a strong, dominant state in European context, that any type of non-EU-wide agreements oftentimes allowed Germany to sort of foster their own sort of independent foreign policy, which then others could kind of draft behind, right? They could join. So if Berlin wanted a special agreement with whether it was Russia, with Turkey, with Israel, with you name the state, others who couldn't get through the requirements, which is unanimity, they could in essence draft behind Berlin. So this was and you've also at this point you have sort of a version of Paris Plus, Rome Plus. There's a lot of these pluses out there, which allows them to basically conduct entrepreneurial defense and foreign policy. So they can choose to go on this mission and not go on that mission, or participate in a particular capability development because that's their strength or that's what their politics will sustain and support. Next slide. So European security per 2003, this is pre-Iraqi invasion, so it's the beginning of 2003, was to secure Europe in a better world. There was a focus, obviously, as a shift. If you look at what we talked about in the 90s, completely to terrorism, WMDs, regional conflicts, state failure, organized crime. And if any of you that had enough connection or lived there or part of that world, if you remember in the 2000s, there was a lot of focus on organized crime. I mean, it was that was almost like a version of terrorism, the way that was maybe in the US or ultimately in UK, Spain, places like that. I mean, eventually, go ahead, please.
I was gonna say, is this really the Kosovo drug trail into Europe, or you're talking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of it, right? It's the former Yugoslavia / Eastern Europe, / the Central Asian conveyor belt kind of all fused together. Europe was, let's say, in the 90s and into the 2000s, it was a pretty entrepreneurial environment for organized crime. I mean, like non-competitive. I mean, it was like a free-for-all. I mean, you could almost argue it was like a Gilded Age. The European states did not have really the cross-border mechanisms. I mean, they might have had the legal authority getting developed into the creation of the EU, but ultimately they didn't have the infrastructure like today. I mean, today, I'm not saying, well, it's all relative, but I'm not saying it's as efficient as a FBI global, transnational case, because the FBI has been doing those maybe for 40 years. But the Europeans, especially when you get their larger, state police institutions, whether in Germany or France, or the Netherlands, et cetera, or the Italians. They're pretty close. I mean, they're probably no more than a decade behind. A lot of it's the technology, new generations, training. I mean, people, best practices basically. So I would argue that that is one of the biggest strengths actually in European security now is in some ways sort of transnational, crime, threats, their ability to sort of cross all these borderlands and pretty dynamically, and I mean like at an operating level, like human intelligence, like you just have a lot of integration there, and they're increasing that, right? Given the border security crises of the 2010s, and the large scale migrants, et cetera, they've really reinforced that, and we'll get into that later in a future episode. But
one of the points
yeah,
made
go
in
ahead.
the comments is that the collapse of the USR certainly also played into the growth of the organized crime and systemic
Absolutely.
crime in
Yeah.
Europe in the early
Yeah.
aughts.
Well, and to be very honest, there was already a forced projection of organized crime as part of state policy by the Soviet Union, by Russia itself, but by other Soviet Union actors, whether it was East Germany, whether it was the Romanian state, where they would leverage organized crime as sort of let's call it a low quality intelligence service, and a way to create compromise or a way to acquire intelligence, et cetera. So once the state shackles were off, then these non-state actors just flourished. Basically, it was sort of like fauna, like bacteriological fauna and heat and acidification. But I would argue the largest networks in the last 5 to 10 years have really been ripped apart. So you're now down to more of that traditional modern Western life where you have, smaller gangs, smaller units. I mean, there are some still that are out there in human trafficking and the sort of conveyor belt of large scale drug importation, things like that. But you don't have these sort of this banquet hall of mafias that were just exploding all over Europe, almost like a bad sort of Marvel movie. That's really been damped down, and a big driver to this is that there was just a lot of violence that was generated. I mean, it's always the driver, whether we've seen it in the U.S. or Japan or any other place, is that when you see sort of violence hitting civilians, or near civilians, then the state power steps in, which is what they've done. So and if people are really interested in this, we could eventually do something on that. Actually, it might be kind of interesting. So next slide real quick here. So strategic objectives, policy implications, we've sort of talked about this, which is, they want to build security in their neighborhood. Their goal was completely driven by effective multilateralism, which was defined every 5 years differently. So it was very crisis driven, and increased capabilities, pursue coherent policies. I mean, some of these are, almost puns to some jokes, because the coherent policies are hard to generate if you're changing your definition of what effective multilateralism is every 5 years, because you're adapting to new threats. So ultimately, it's hard to have coherent policies. So next slide. One big thing that was developed was the European Defense Agency, which in some ways was a pretty static, and it wasn't even evolved enough to be very bureaucratic for quite a while, until really about the last 5-7 years. And really the French, of course, are the largest actor in attempting to push this. This is about building, in essence, European defense champions. So see it as, defense contractors across Europe, aligning all of the states with common defense procurement, creating standards across all the different products, et cetera, and then ultimately increasing capacity. So in the last year, 2 years pre-invasion, there's been really a extremely large push by the French, and I believe this will be, well, this will be the institution that either Europe's adaptation to the invasion of Ukraine either succeeds or fails long term, primarily because this is where you're going to have to drive. I mean, not meetings, not PowerPoints, not fantastic tapas breakfasts, but for leaders. But this is, we're talking the mechanics where you're actually building a defense instrumentation, right? You're building your next 1,000 jets, your next 100, 200 ships, your next, et cetera, and coordinating that and being able to actually construct the bureaucracy and administration capability that can work across all these states. So either this works in the next decade and Europe, in essence, becomes a significant or the significant regional security power in their backyard, and one of the, let's say 4 largest in the world, or they stay fragmented and, they're sort of, entrepreneurial, opportunistic projects. Some work, some don't work. It's not very cohesive. It depends on strong-willed actors to sort of shove it through and make those things work, which is where they are now, obviously. Right. If you don't have one of these actors that say, hey, we're going to push this new standard for X, Y, Z, it just doesn't happen. Right. Everyone builds their own thing. And then, or not everybody, the handful of actors that can build it. Everybody else sits on the sideline and waits, and or starts buying something else from someone else completely differently. And so to me, this is actually one of these like little hidden, I always like to look at hidden history, but one of these little institutions that I think is sort of important.
So we've actually got 2 questions. The first one is that there seems to be some implicit in the way that you've described it, that military investment will work to help fight corruption, mafia, drug trade, all these kinds of things. Can you clarify the nexus between military investment and combating all of these issues?
Oh, yeah. So let me make sure I bring this up to date. So the EDA getting created was in some ways independent of a cohesive strategy of the 2000s. So I should have probably prefaced that. This was in some ways how to leverage traditional military security capabilities and build a unified a defense procurement institutional framework. This had very little to do, except maybe in a very small amount of let's say computer technology or data standards. You could say, yeah, I mean that would be about it. That would actually be directly related to, let's say, terrorism, counterterrorism, organized crime, et cetera. So this was really about the traditional industrial technological base to construct a modern defense capability. So this had in some ways nothing to do with the missions in the 2000s whatsoever. And in some ways, this is really more to do with today's mission. So they sort of laid this framework out there. It had a few hundred people working there for a long time. Dozens actually start with. That was it for, I think, about 4 years. And then it went up to maybe about 100, 150. And then in the 2010s, it's required France, in essence, at various stages of French political leadership to sort of give it a shove. And of course, that's highly tied to the large French, defense giants, wanting to sell, procure, drive, procurement across the EU of their products. And then others have leveraged the EDA when it was in their interest, right? So if the Germans wanted to push a new class of coastal boats and ships that they make, which are some of the best in the world, if not the best, Germany is sort of a weird actor in this. Germany obviously says yes to everything. that's common, that's multilateral, et cetera. But how much they coordinate their own actions and state actors to support it is a whole nother story. In many cases, they don't. So that is seemingly changing, or we're going to see if it's going to change. The commitment this year from Germany is that it will change. France, Netherlands, Italy, to a lesser degree, but they've now kind of jumped on the bandwagon, which has really given the EDA a lot of its capability, really, to be honest. This is one area that, big picture, it was a huge loss of the UK through Brexit. The French like it because the French, defense companies have less competition. But in terms of the capacity for the EU, having the UK in the EU, and especially as a substantial partner in the EDA, and ultimately, I think they would have been one of the co-leaders of the EDA, if not the leader, given their combination of naval, air, land, and let's say space type technology or intelligence collection technology that they have, which is, I think, on aggregate, more capable than the French, just at an industrial level. But the EDA lost that, so the French are the big winners in this. But it also means they're losing a lot of the cutting edge capabilities that the UK had, and also they're losing the competition, which would have made the French better, and the Italians and others. So hopefully that answers her question.
Yeah, the second question sort of folds into the discussion you just had, which is how do the EDA objectives play within the individual countries? You talked about how, for example, in Germany, it's seen as a positive. In some of the does it become an issue with subsidiarity, for example, where you start to override local national defense projects? How do different countries feel about having less control over their defense?
Well, I mean, it doesn't, because of the fact that within the EU treaty mechanisms and directives, your foreign policy and your defense policy is still fundamentally independent. You are encouraged, and there's an enormous amount of mechanisms for sharing, for let's say policy coordination, et cetera. But there's never has been, and I doubt there ever will be, a mandate. I mean, if there is, then you'll have a European constitution, and then you can call it the European, or the whatever, United European States, or whatever it would be called at that point, right? Because then you're looking at folding in all of the national institutional prerogatives at that point, which would include finance, budget. I mean, the kitchen sink is coming in, which that might happen this century. I don't see that in the cards the next 20 years. And to be honest, especially with the massive expansion of Central Eastern Europe, if the sort of more initial European configuration, you could probably have seen a little more integration than we have now. But once you have that massive expansion to Central Eastern Europe, in some ways, the EU is sort of a multi-tiered system in terms of how institutionally integrated the states are with the institutions of the EU. One other actor that it would be very fascinating in the next 5 years, because they're building, they were already building substantial capability, but because of the war in Ukraine, I mean, their capability is going to be, I argue, first rate in the next decade, is Poland. So Poland could be a very interesting actor in the EDA, actually, because an enormous amount of German defense products are actually co-manufactured in Poland, not maybe by the Polish government, obviously, because these are private entities, but there is a substantial cooperation just from a manufacturing perspective. So I could see that as something that adds a new competitive layer to the EDA. Next slide.
So one last question actually just came in. So the question really is, what is the defense industry for? What's the objective?
Yeah.
Is it to invade other countries? Is it to take down totalitarian regimes? Is it to aggressively posture? And does the EDA have the same sorts of concerns as the United States does, or the EU generally?
Yeah. Well, the EDA is in essence just a procurement and management organization. It doesn't have foreign policy. It doesn't have an army to invade anything. What it's trying to do, I'll give you an example. If there's a new Rafale fighter, or when there was one, it wanted to coordinate the let's say the procurement marketing of that across other states and their annual procurement cycles, looking for marketing and also let's say optimizing the French manufacturing development of it so that it would its supply chain would be developing and configuring those products within the EU, and then in essence regulating all of those aspects of it, so that you have things like they never really nailed these things, but this is sort of their aspirations, is to create things called like the European standard fighter, or the European standard frigate, or the European standard corvette, for different ships or coastal crafts, or a battle rifle, or different tanks, all the sort of large dollar ticket items that a modern state to have defensive capacity, much less to be able to contribute to the greater defense of the other states that are part of NATO and EU, assuming that the EU states we're talking about are also members of NATO. So they're obviously offering the capacity to defend those other states. So that's the function of the EDA, right? The EDA is not setting foreign policy. It's not setting policy, at a transnational level or at an EU level. It can advise, if you have 7 different options for a particular product. It can advise to say, well, the content of these 2 are the most EU, or the most componentry, or generate the most jobs, or whatever it is. So that's the function of the EDA. And then obviously over time, assuming, and this is where this decade we'll see how much capacity the EDA actually has to generate, because there is a finite issue in Europe, in that they have for so long not developed, let's say, large scale deterrence capabilities, hard power deterrence capabilities. There just aren't a lot of people who do this, and the handful that do it are going to be working domestically for most states as they're redeveloping their joint and sort of cohesive deterrence, border hard power sort of strategy. So there's going to be an issue of just talent, and obviously there's a lot of European requirements to be able to work. Yes, and the EDA is of course part of the EU. I mean, that's how it's that is how it is actually incorporated. So so these are a bunch of institutions that were constructed in the 90s and 2000s, which are European Union Institute for Security Studies, which is nowadays you have a sort of European Union satellite centers for studies of all kinds of security, defense, foreign policy. I mean, there's got to be close to, at this point, at least 100 of these across Europe. Most of these are civilian. I mean, almost, I'd say 3/4 are civilian driven, at least, if not more, 80-90%. There's always been these sort of headline objectives, which is to have autonomous, strategic autonomy, improve readiness, deployability, but it's always been on these small scale non-state actor or asymmetrical kind of challenges that have that the EU either categorizes or feels that those are the priority threats versus large scale military capabilities. Next slide. The Treaty of Lisbon changes, which we're not going to talk an enormous amount about this today, but I just want you guys to know that's a thing that happened because it's important at the end of the 2000s because it sets the structure that we have today, but it basically shifted from the ESDP, which is what we're really going to focus on in terms of what the 2000s were about, to the CSDP, which is Common Security and Defense Policy. And then that sort of cohesively began this integration on the foreign and security policy. And I think the important way to view this was not about military capability. This was about constructing a foreign policy and at least the infrastructure. And then wherever there were small enough threats that the states could handle and felt comfortable handling, they could participate in sort of Berlin Plus type arrangements or independent entrepreneurial sort of opportunistic policies, as long as it met, requirements around, legal, human rights, et cetera, requirements. And then it constructed a high rep, or created the position for high rep for foreign affairs and security policy, which I think is very important that it defines it that way, not a defense. There's no Secretary of Defense in the EU for the EU. That doesn't exist. So it didn't establish the common European defense. Next slide. And so this is where, there's the, and I think this is important because people have social, moral, and sort of practical aspirations to why doesn't X do more? Why can't, Y do this? And there are these very explicit clauses, right? And these weren't written out of thin air. These were written by the states in the 2000s to be very clear to where their line was, their red line in terms of what they're willing to do. So it says things like, or stated things like, if a member state is a victim of an armed attack on its territory, it can rely on the aid and assistance of other member states, which are obliged to help. Two restrictions: does not affect the security and defense policy of certain member states, specifically those which are traditionally neutral. Does not affect the commitments made under the framework of NATO. So it draws this extremely tiny space where it can have mutual defense. So it is not supposed to act as an Article 5, which we'll get into later. NATO, we're not going to talk about NATO. Oh, we'll talk a little bit about NATO today, but we're not.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, can we just take a second to talk about that? Because to my eyes, I don't see how this helps any country if they're also a NATO member. I can see, pre 2022, Sweden and Finland having protection because of this, but beyond that, I don't really see the use.
Well, I think the best way to think of it is that the purpose of NATO is large scale deterrence. And the purpose of European defense is to deal with, let's say, more asymmetrical or more regional, sub-regional, defense and security threats. And so NATO, given its historical structure and its function and design, is actually in some ways very different in terms of its orientation than constructing the mutual defense. Because the thing to realize is this is not a mutual defense treaty, which is very different, because Europe, I say Europe, these modern European states have been extremely conservative not to have any of the instrumentation pre-World War II that Europe had developed for several centuries around mutual defense treaties. They did not want to have these sort of switches getting flipped of, this complicated matrix that can take you from a small, rock throwing contest in one place or another into a full scale
I mean, because it's not like
continental
Europe had
war.
ever seen that before.
Exactly. So you can never forget that's behind an enormous amount of the constraints that Europe sets for its own structural defense in its relationships to each other, which I do think is fundamentally in conflict, with their larger stated aims of having a more cohesive Europe, because and for obvious reasons. Well, I mean, I'm not saying vegetables that are not treated well don't kill you, but fundamentally, vegetable trading doesn't kill you. And having a mutual trading clause to be able to have food products sold back and forth across, is something that they do all the time, obviously, because they have common regulations. Now, but even there are limits, right? So you might, let's say you were a farm, you might have somebody doing a audit, that's from the agricultural policy level of the EU, just for data collection and so on. But your actual regulator will still be, let's say you're in Italy, in northern Italy, that'll be someone from, if you're in Tuscany or whatever, that'll be from there. And you might have one from, countrywide. But you aren't, so there still is this dimension there where there's a lot of locality, and you mix that together with the fact that they don't want mutual defense treaties, and you get this very, very, very small space, which is really more about sharing resources, sharing information. It's not about rebadging, right? Nobody's taking Germans and rebadging them as French and putting them on French frigates, right? Like, that's not what's going on. And none of the states, there's no mechanism for that. So that's not going to happen. The next slide, please. This is, we've talked about this in the past, but as part of this was about constructing also all kinds of multinational Euro forces, which is this, obviously the UK was part of this, which they're not anymore, but, European Air Group, European Maritime, Land Forces, but different ones. Basically, all of these have failed. They never had any real support. They were much more aspirational. The French have consistently been the sort of pro-European army construction state, and that sort of goes in some waves based on their domestic politics, but they're consistent. And the Germans, have typically been, sure, sounds like a great idea. Oh, shucks, don't have anyone to send. That tends to be sort of the relationship there. And then a bunch of states either take the German position, say, oh, I didn't get the memo, I don't know what you're talking about, or want to contribute to the French approach, because either they're so small and anything that can support their capacity is a benefit. So they're acting obviously in their own keen interest. I do think this isn't going to happen in the modern world, but you will see a much more integrated cooperation in the 2020s coming out of this invasion of Ukraine. There's really no alternative for all these states. Next slide.
Actually, we have a few questions before we go to the next slide.
Sure.
The first one is, can you talk about how the European defense policy deals with the question of Palestine? Because the Palestinian Authority is a government that's composed of a number of organizations, especially Fatah, that have historically been decried as terrorist organizations. How does the European Union manage this from a defense perspective, and how are the individual nation states involved?
I think the right answer is very, very, very carefully. I think it's important to separate the foreign policy, the security policy, the defense policy from, let's say, the social and political and economic policy portfolios they have. And so as there are various, and even cultural and others, right? So we look at the sort of multi-domain, if you have like 20 of these as domains, there's a set of these that can cooperate with the with the authority, in certain areas of economics, development, certain areas of aid, cultural and social dimensions, and even some when it comes to certain aspects of politics, of political support, or of generating regional support and cooperation. But as you shift towards anything that is security, foreign policy, defense, military aid, that's pretty constrained. There's one area which is policing, like a building capacity building. So that's an area that tends to be within individual states, right? Because there's not a European police force, right? There's no, EPD badges that people wear and run around. So, if there are, French, trainers from various French or other Europeans, dozens of other Europeans that send their own police trainers or people to do various, counter narcotics, you name it, those type of things. That type of cooperation is actually, typically pretty substantial. So that's like a state capacity building. So I would see it in those places, but you're not going to see it when it comes to defense, security, intelligence, and because that steps on this larger, the larger set of issues, which is the Palestinian Authority having full authority over the occupied territories, and they don't have that, and so it you wind up having just a lot of friction and conflict written around that. So I don't know if you want to add anything else, Richard, because I'm sure there's a bunch of legal constraints also, obviously.
Right. No, I was going to say that a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about European security and defense is with regards to what is happening on European soil. And so to the extent that Palestinian terrorist organizations are not directly targeting EU citizens, right, they're targeting Israeli citizens, that sort of falls outside of the purview of a lot of these defensive organizations.
That's right.
And falls more into the foreign policies of the individual members of the European Union.
That's right. And I would say you start to have a little bit of play when you have various other non-state actor type entities, whether it was ISIS or Al Qaeda or others that in essence targeted, whether it's Israelis or other Middle Easterners or foreign tourists or just domestic people, whether it's in Egypt or in other states. And you will have intelligence sharing, information sharing, things like that. So anyways, next slide.
Just a few more questions, actually.
Oh.
One of them was that if Europe is really regulating this, is this really because Europe has suffered war and it's not the simple business of building bigger weapons and more lethal and efficient guns, that they need all this cooperation, that it's much more regulated than other industries? I mean to that I would, my sort of response is just generally yes. There's also a comment that I get the sense that some policy decisions being made on these issues are somewhat suspended pending clearer signals or outcomes of the Russian war in Ukraine. Do you think that we're going to that these are suspended, that they'll become clearer after the war? What's your sort of take on this?
Yeah, I mean, we'll cover this more as we get into the 2010s, and then we eventually get to sort of the modern institutions we have today, which all of these evolved. These were the precursors for that evolution. So I mean, yeah, there's going to be a massive evolution because ultimately what we have to recognize with the EU, and we've seen this, and the individual European actors really since the end of the Cold War, even during the Cold War, is it's always a crisis response adaptation feedback loop, right? So they're always going to construct security, foreign policy, defense, military, intelligence, policing on fighting the last battle, whatever that happens to be. If it's transnational drug trafficking, and they typically do a pretty good job of it, right? Once they orient themselves, right? They are like an aircraft carrier or a very large battleship. Is that it might take them quite a while, years, many times even decades. But once they orient themselves, I mean, they tend to commit across all their institutions eventually, because basically there's almost like a set of political, social, cultural physics that takes over, right? Like it's like that common driver of that priority threat becomes common across, dozens of states. So I would say, this decade, I, will not be shocked if you see a very robust transition into, a European land deterrent and air force that it becomes pretty integrated and interoperable, and becomes really kind of the bulwark of NATO, really ultimately for its own deterrent defense. Next slide. So as a protocol of Lisbon, we talked about this, which is how to supply forces, which never really happened. The EDA, sort of assesses and tries to manage what these contributions are. What's your percentage, which is not the NATO percentage, right? So that's not the 2%, right? That is much more almost like a budget agency, right? Like think of it this way: in most countries, their Ministry of Defense or Defense Department will have the equivalent of a comptroller, and in some ways, the EDA acts as like a overseer of the controllers, not overseer like auditor of it, let's say, but more of, you stated you're planning on buying, 15 aircraft. Your politics and your budgeting, your taxes, your this and that and the other have, you still say you're going to buy 15, but now you're spreading it out over 6 years, right? Or whatever. And so the EDA will, try to collect that, maybe massage that, try to figure out how to, improve that, optimize that, find out some other supporting institution that might, lend that money for maybe instead of 6 years, it's 3 years or whatever, right? Like, so that's a lot of, the type of tooling, and then creating these structured cooperation. And so this is the big thing, is the council, which we've talked about in a few 6 months ago, really, around how the EU Council and the Commission really dictates, obviously, all of these institutions. And so the other thing too, that to realize is that the member states are free to withdraw or participate in these permanent structured cooperation as long as they meet the commitment criteria. So these are extremely flexible, which, they could leave for political reasons because they have new politics. They could leave for financial reasons because they really don't have anything to contribute. They could leave for kind of operational reasons because they just don't have the people, right, to do the work, because they might be focused on missions, right? They might have UN missions, they might have other NATO missions, so on, and they just don't have, they just don't have the capacity. So there's a bunch of reasons why they could come and go. And over the years, that's what's happened, actually. I do think that has changed and will change permanently. So I think this will be more permanent than it was 15 years ago, let's say. Next slide.
I just have a question
Yep.
actually about this. If they can come and go as they please based on political, economic, other factors,
Mhm.
doesn't this sort of get into articles of confederation type territory
Oh,
where
yeah.
you have a situation where from an external party, this does not look like a viable, defendable piece of territory
Mhm.
because at a moment's notice, half the coalition members might just leave.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this, however flimsy European institutions do look, because there is this grand acceptance, independent of, random local politics that, sort of ebbs and flows. But the big arc of history here is to be more tied together from a European perspective, and especially security, defense, foreign policy. Um, there tends to be this crisis response. So the states, even if they're fighting the last battle, they do make that commitment to fight that last battle. So the present battle you're in could look extremely shaky, and it does often. But if you go back and look at the prior battle they had, which looked flimsy then, it's a lot more resilient today, right? So if you look at the gaps in cooperation and even capacity they had in the 2000s when it came to terrorism and drug trafficking and all kinds of non-state actor behaviors, Europe is, probably one of the, handful of strongest, set of, meta states, multi-state institutions around the world in terms of handling those threats. And you could test this out by the responsiveness, right? So it's not just they have a bunch of PowerPoints and people with executive titles in buildings in Brussels, but they have co-integrated capacity that's driven all the way down at the state level. Even though at the local level, it's always the individual states, of course, but the coordination and planning apparatus is in place and gets used. You see it now with dealing with various migrant waves that you've had in the last, let's say 24, 36 months, which are handled radically differently than they were 5, 10 years ago. And so, I would argue as the threats have become larger, they seem to be stepping up. Now, there's that delay, that 5, 10 years of it looking pretty flimsy, but don't underestimate the scale of the commitment once they make these commitments, even though they might be behind the 8 ball forever, but they're still building towards that last battle. And eventually, because the world is what it is, it will always be, a dynamic place with lots of threats. Some of those old battles that they weren't prepared for will come back around, and you'll see response from these actors, both individually, as states and across Europe, respond very differently than they did, when those threats occurred originally. So, I do think that's the net positive when you look at these things.
So, how did these structures work with regards to the refugee crisis in 2015? Or
they didn't. I mean, because you had extremely entrepreneurial policy, right? I mean, when Angela Merkel declared on a Wednesday a new policy and sort of sandbagged everybody, right? She just didn't sandbag the EU, right? She sandbagged her own German political system and everybody in between. That was pretty unilateral policy, right? So, and that was gargantuan given the scale. Now, you could argue she was responding to the lack of response, fair, but as the major actor, I would say it's fair that the Germans could have put an enormous amount of pressure on the European institutions to maybe be, let's say, a cooperative partner in that policy. And so, I think the migrant crisis objectively was, given the scale and scope of it. Well, what's interesting about it is Europe absorbed it. So you could say it was a net positive because they did absorb the 5 million people over 4-ish years. But the response to it was a disaster. I mean, I don't think there's any other way to look at it, because it sort of did like a shark thrashing in the water in European politics, because all the states were, making up their own policy based on what they saw best fit for themselves, and responding to each other that way. And the European Union's European Union institutions just did not enter in any significant way. You could make an argument. There's a corollary right now with the UN and the Ukrainian conflict, right? The UN can come in and try to deal with the nuclear plant issue. They could deal with unlocking grain shipments, which is great. These are fantastic things, but they're not a dominant actor in what's going on right now in Ukraine. And in some ways, the EU was the same way. Now, I would argue if you had a similar event or set of events again, I think the European coordination would be different. I think Ukraine's unique in that European coordination has been weak again, but I think that's primarily because the migration, the displacement of people, IDPs and cross-border, have been primarily into Eastern and Central Europe. And the Eastern Central European states, to be blunt, don't have a lot of authority at the EU level. I mean, they just don't. They're considered socially and culturally junior members, even if legally they aren't. And so since those migrants aren't hitting France and Germany in any scale, and the Netherlands and Nordics, et cetera, Benelux, whatever, you don't really have a big prioritization of this. I believe if the Ukraine, and it's not possible, physically, but if those migrants were hitting those states, I think the European response would have been very different. So I do think, and I always think you're going to have this friction structurally between the states and the EU, regardless of protocols, until you have a constitution in Europe, because nobody is going to cede their foreign policy, security and defense, et cetera, to some other larger third party. Because in a certain way, it is sort of an evolution of the mutual defense treaty model, to be honest. We don't kind of see it that way, but it sort of is, right? If even though there's supposed to be a council and a commission, if there's dominant parties that are making the decisions, which is a big shift that the dominant parties are trying to do, the Germans, the French, are attempting to move away from unanimity in voting for large-scale critical events, crises, so they can have faster responses to a qualified majority. I think that will be a seismic shift in European affairs between the states. That will be a big deal if that happens, because at that point you are, in essence, the French and Germans become somewhat colonial foreign policy actors. I don't mean in the 18th, 19th century of being a colonial power. I mean within the European sphere, they become the dominant foreign policy, security. They already are economically, et cetera. And that could have a seismic impact in European politics, basically, if that happens. Sorry, next slide. So the CSDP missions of the EU. So this is really about, as we talked about, the main aims: peacekeeping, strengthening international security, relying on civil military assets provided by member states. I would say one thing not to dismiss is the ability of the European states and let's say the EU for coordinating capacity in peacekeeping is pretty substantial. I would argue, while the UN has more experience over generations in actually doing peacekeeping, the management of it, in terms of actual capacity, large scale capacity, and I mean, especially complex capacity, I mean, the European states are probably second to none in the world at this point. I mean, they really are. They do a terrible job marketing this because It's fragmented across, 20 plus countries, 27 countries, whatever, plus, 5, 10 different domains, 20 domains in each country. So it's like, it's like 1,000 little pieces. But that sort of is this banquet of, I would say pretty 3-star, 2 and 3-star food, good enough for most, way better than most banquets, that the mission can configure itself around all of that capacity. So I think that's something that is, I don't think Europeans understand this. I don't think Europeans who are doing peacekeeping, except for people who this is their full-time job, really understand how capable European capacity is in peacekeeping right now. In some ways, that's what they invested in, whether they knew it or not. They ultimately invested in whether it was peacekeeping, peacemaking, and they drew a larger circle around the definition of peacekeeping, right? And that a lot of that had to do, really, to be honest, with former Yugoslavia. It was they put, ultimately it was a NATO mission, but it really became a European NATO mission. So they did, once again, fight the last battle. They did catch up. And when you see the capacity in places like Kosovo, or let's say drug and human trafficking and interdiction in the former Yugoslavia, I mean, you will see a substantial capacity there that they have. So, and that capacity isn't just, like I say, someone's with a badge, because there isn't someone with a badge that says European Army on it. A lot of it is advisory, it's training, it's information management, and all this sort of boring stuff that is really fundamental to building capacity, long term especially. So these become really careers for people, right? It's not just you cycle into a peacekeeping mission for 1 or 2 years, and then you cycle back to your old job in your state military, branch, but that 5 or 10 years you'll spend. Like, this is the dominant aspect of your career, or one of the dominant ones. So next slide.
One thing that
Yep.
came up in the comments that I was sort of curious to have your opinion on: if Merkel did such a injurious action by sort of sidestepping European policy and sidestepping her own CDU in Germany, why was it that she was reelected with considerable strength for the CDU? What was sort of the turnaround there, and why didn't this hurt her as badly as it could have?
Well, I mean, you could, we could, when we eventually get to each of the countries and the evolution of their security defense policy. I mean, if you're within Germany, if you're starting off at Michael Jordan level, or Cristiano Ronaldo level of superstar, and you have a gambling scandal, I'm just using kind of an example or metaphor here. I mean, that'll impact you, but you still are that Michael Jordan or Cristiano Ronaldo, that sort of superstar. And Merkel was and is the dominant political figure in the post-Kohl politics in Germany in the last 30 years. I mean, there's just not a question about that. So her cachet was so substantial, and then you could argue, because it was so substantial, the actors within German politics were so leery of really taking her on in any real way. Even though during the migrant crisis, you could say there was substantial grumbling. And then I would say part of that cachet is sort of, and you could almost treat it in a little imperial way, right? It was like, like Angela the Great, right? In a certain way, not really, but I mean, in the German context, it's, if she feels this is what we need to do, then this is what we need to do. Because she steered us in 100 other ways, and I don't think it goes without saying that she has been, during the last 20 years, the dominant political actor. Well, if you count Russia as part of Europe, then it's her and Putin as the two dominant political actors on the European stage. If you're only counting, Central, Eastern, and Western Europe, it's Angela Merkel. So, so that really insulated her, and to her credit and the institutional credit within Germany, once the Germans decide to do things, often they get them done. Maybe not everything, but when it comes to sort of processing, millions of people, which they did, and there was obviously exceptions and there's problems, and you will have these sort of and we're talking about individual people's lives. These are these can be extremely difficult, but overall, if you're looking at sort of I'm not gonna. I think making an assimilation argument is a different one, but in terms of like cultural assimilation is a different one. But in terms of just being able to assimilate functionally in German society, meaning like they have ID cards, they have healthcare, their kids are in school, people have access to training programs, housing, like the whole panoply of the German state social capacity. They processed millions of people over 3-4 years. So in some ways, those became success stories. And so that would be my answer in terms of why or how it worked. And I think that was extremely unique to German politics. If a lightweight scandal, half rocks a French leader, or the standard, corruption of the week knocks off an Italian leader, or just some bad form, or weird dancing and going to parties knocks off a UK leader, that tells you how ultimately fragile many of those state leaders are. Or maybe in Finland next, now with someone going to some party or whatever and having a good time. But if you're talking about absorbing 2 million people, which if you look at it from other places in the world, if you're looking at the United States, this would be equivalent of 8 million people, right? I mean, which you couldn't even imagine the scale of that, right? I mean, that would just be astronomical. I mean, that would just rock. And I don't think the U.S. is unique in this. I think she just had a certain cachet in history that obviously I just don't see repeated. There's very few actors out there in the world. Maybe Abe did. Obviously he's no longer with us, but I think he was sort of like a junior version of that, or he had become or was becoming that. If he had gotten reelected, maybe that's probably where he would have been, very close to that. But there just aren't very many actors like that. You could say Draghi was like a junior version, but Italian politics is so combustible. In some ways, I don't even know what that buys you in Italy. So anyway, so some of the CSDP missions of the EU, so missions to Moldova and Ukraine in 2005. So this was what we were talking about, really, dealing with head on with border assistance missions, smuggling, trafficking, customs fraud, European Union monitoring missions in Georgia. We'll get into the Georgia piece later in terms of how the EU, let's say, was very maybe neutral in what Russia was doing in Georgia, very UN-like. So next slide.
Can you actually talk a little bit about what's going on in Africa there?
Yes. So I would say one of the largest set of extremely positive missions maybe anyone's been doing the last 15 years has been the European Union missions to Africa. We'll get into that. I have a whole sort of part of a presentation later that will talk about the EU relationship with Africa, and there's I want to say it's 18 missions, something like that. It's 15 to 20 missions across Africa over the last decade plus. And I would say this is a combination of a lot of things, right? It's a combination of recognizing their historical responsibilities, or at least, yeah, I'd say acknowledging them. That's probably the right way to put it. To Africa over the centuries of colonialism and incredible, destruction that occurred there in their colonial expansion, and then also acting as a positive force in capacity building, because ultimately, Africa is, right underneath European Union. I mean, physically, right? In some ways, it's sort of like the way Central South America is to North America, the Mexico, US, and Canada. And so recognizing, some of the benefits of that politically, economically, socially, culturally, security, you name it. And then it also fed a lot of those missions we were talking about, right? Which was whether it was smuggling, whether it was human trafficking, whether it was terrorism, state capacity building needs, and then ones that I'd say would be selfish, which was economic, right? Because as China moved in, and now Russia obviously is moving in. I mean, not that they ever moved out really, but they sort of took their foot off the gas for a long time, but they're clearly going to be in a pretty aggressive way, because they have a huge history in Africa. The Russians do, since really the 50s and 60s. And so I think the Europeans see it as a competitive landscape vis-a-vis Russia and China. And so, you have all those factors that are there. And we'll get into that as a whole separate presentation, because I think it absolutely deserves, it's another one of these extremely under appreciated aspects. I don't think except for nerds of this in Europe, I don't think anybody knows this or understands this. I mean, you can go out there looking for Deutsche Welle or France 24, which has probably the broadest BBC-like coverage of European affairs, and you just won't find, you'll find an individual show here and there on one individual piece of one mission, but no one will explain the whole mission set out there. You've got to dig through, which is what I did to make that part of that future presentation. You have to dig through all these sort of European documents and organizations to sort of figure it out. Next slide. So, this is an eye chart, but I think it's important to give you a sense of, this is some of the terminology on the left. So when you see all these acronyms, and then obviously the member states of, UN, OECD, NATO, EU only, etc. Different special cases. And of course, this is, we're looking circa 2005-6, range. So March 2006, which is the coverage area that we're focused on, right? So this isn't up to date. We'll bring it up to date as we move over in time. Those of you that, want this, you can you'll have it on the YouTube, or just take a screenshot or whatever, and you can find this online actually. So next slide. This was sort of an old joke, but it's still quite real. So you look at the West European Union, the members. You look at the EU. Look at the NATO members, and then this was literally a phone number they had to the EU New Situation and Crisis Center. That number obviously doesn't work anymore, but so this was a joke to, well, how do you actually coordinate all of this? And the answer was, you really didn't. I mean, you had a bunch of people coordinating between each other, but you weren't really coordinating to substantial missions. I mean, ultimately, what you see in most European action is that the which you would view as the sort of headquarters command and control is pretty weak and chaotic. But once you get a mission set defined and you allocate those various parties and partners to that mission, the Czech medical people, the Hungarian communications people, the on and on and on and on, and they start working together, you do then start having a mission, and that mission starts to do its job. And so once it deploys out of that bureaucratic environment, you will see those missions really work. And I would argue, given and when I say mission, a mission is sort of like a UN mission, and then you have the missions from the individual let's say sub actors and subsets of that larger mission. So so you might have over the years 1,000 deployments from the EU in all kinds of various directions. And I would say, that is by itself capacity, right? Because very few places in the world can push that. But the Chinese don't have that. The Chinese haven't deployed 1,000 different, don't have 1,000 different deployments across multinational, action zones and as part of larger political and foreign policy and defense missions. And the Russians don't have that. I mean, really, the only other party that has versions of that is the UN, and and I'd say at a smaller level, the United States and NATO, basically. So, which this folds into NATO too, right? So they don't kind of get commingled, but that's the only thing like that in the world. So next slide. All right, so we're going to finish talking about today are the deployments in the 2000s and how they happened and what the European states did. So for obviously, I think everyone remembers 9/11 and what the response was, which the European states, obviously declared solidarity. There was quite a few European citizens or people of the European states that lost their life on 9/11. And the EU itself took on some substantial commitments. So as the war in Afghanistan began in the response to 9/11 in basically October of 01 in through, especially the first 4 years, the initial phase, basically the EU took the lead on the humanitarian mission. And then ultimately, they became the second largest donor in humanitarian aid and economic development after the US over time. But, I think it's realistic to say that everybody developed strategic exhaustion, as it's called, because while that initial commitment of the EU occurred, that basically dissolved over time. Because I think what happened in Europe, and we'll get into this with the war in Iraq, is that European foreign policy and the security establishment was so against the Iraq war, and that's their prerogative and somewhat quite justified at various levels, that they commingled that with the war and reconstruction and redevelopment in Afghanistan, and they couldn't keep those two plates in the air, right? They couldn't on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays go to meetings with people from the US to talk about Afghanistan, and then at the same time Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday and Sunday be against the Iraq war. And ultimately what that did is that really minimized over time that the commitments they had to Afghanistan. Those commitments really shifted to NATO. And in many ways, only the countries in NATO that wanted to commit to the Afghanistan conflict from a military perspective or capacity building, which I argue this diminished the reconstruction dramatically. I think it's something that's not studied at all, right? Because people in Europe aren't, generally speaking, going to want to, recognize some culpability in that. And I think people feel justified that that was the right thing to do because they didn't want to have any association to the United States at that point, given the invasion of Iraq. But I would argue, given the capacity that EU states were developing in the 2000s for peacekeeping capability, and they were testing it on the ground because of their deployments in Yugoslavia and deployments in Africa and other places, they really had this, they were developing this very special capability, both in peacekeeping and then linking it with humanitarian aid and then ultimately economic aid, which you see them doing in Africa now, and arguably more successful than anybody, probably by a mile. And Afghanistan really didn't get much of that. They got some of that sort of indirectly through the NATO missions, but they were very, they were limited, maybe 10 or 20% of what was capable. So that's one of those, not much reported on type events over time, because it sort of got lost in the broader mush of the 2000s and strategic exhaustion in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, Iraq, et cetera. Obviously before the Arab Spring and the overthrow, the overthrow in Libya, and then Syria collapse, and so on. So next slide.
Actually, we have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, have the various EU participants in Afghanistan achieved a greater success in reflecting upon the errors of Afghanistan, and the US has even begun to acknowledge as necessary?
That the US acknowledges necessary. I understand that maybe someone wants a you're right, you're wrong type of answer, maybe from a state. States usually don't give you that in time. I would say the NATO mission, which in some ways was an evolution of what the European states were doing already, incorporated what they could, but as the European states pulled back, because it was sort of weird, right? They were sending, some states were sending military capacity or some humanitarian aid capacity because they could do it, while other states who didn't have that military capacity were just shutting down their humanitarian capacity or not supporting it. And so you would just sort of have that piece taken off the table, and there was nobody else that could build that back up. And some of the reasons were because the security environment deteriorated. I think one thing that's not really fully understood is after 01, 02, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, large insurgent forces, Haqqani, networks, others were substantially disrupted and very fragmented, and went to a much more cellular, smaller configuration in 03, 05 timeframe. By 06, 07, they basically had regenerated. And so you could argue the same way as the US had a surge in Iraq in 07, 08, you could say the Taliban had a surge in Afghanistan in the 06, 07 timeframe. And that, without a substantial NATO mission and a much more pure humanitarian and sort of proto peacekeeping support that European states were doing, really impacted them, right? Because the security environment deteriorated dramatically. And so that was a big driver of that. And so you had the security environment deteriorating. You had this, Taliban surge. You had a new NATO mission as a counter to that, which was very NATO led. I mean, it was very European led in Afghanistan, not just US as the dominant actor only. The US became sort of the dominant actor over time. In sort of when President Obama came in, the US commitment to Afghanistan sort of amplified militarily, and the NATO mission amplified at the same time. So it was sort of like US NATO surges occurred. You'd say the NATO had several of these, 07, 08, and then another one maybe in, the 10, 11 timeframes. But the EU, humanitarian and let's say peacekeeping one sort of collapsed, to be honest. I mean, it just folded in a little bit into the NATO mission. It was, a shell of itself. Let's see, next question.
So sort of building on that, I wanted to
Yep.
sort of make a few other notes. She added, I meant errors as pertains to declaring war in the first place, not being the appropriate defense response to 9/11. I disagree. I think in the invasion of Afghanistan made perfect sense after 9/11, to dismantle the Al-Qaeda networks that were responsible for the perpetration of the atrocity, simply because the Taliban wouldn't have handed them over. There were negotiations throughout September, and the Taliban kept refusing. So I agree that the invasion of Iraq makes no sense under the rubric of 9/11, but Afghanistan does. The fundamental issue with Afghanistan, and it's something that you didn't cover as much, Aaron, at least from my view, was that the United States government made a deal with Hamid Karzai and a number of the members of the Northern Alliance in order to establish a governing coalition after the fall of the Taliban. And the warlords of the Northern Alliance were not better from a citizen on the ground perspective than the Taliban. They were just differently bad.
Yep.
And so
Well, I didn't want to go down the whole Afghan
yeah,
rabbit hole,
exactly.
but obviously,
And so
yeah.
and so if we're talking about the failure of Afghanistan, I don't think either the United States leadership or the EU leadership has really acknowledged that when they made that bargain, they basically bargained for a regime that couldn't get the goodwill of the Afghan people behind it. And that's ultimately what led them to accept the devil they knew as opposed to the devil that was there. But again, I don't see that in the US or the EU reflections on the
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to go down the whole rat hole because obviously, that's a whole separate conversation. And you've had a series that I'm sure you're going to get to, et cetera.
I'll probably get to the Afghanistan war sometime, 2025.
That's right.
At the rate we're going now.
But yeah.
It's a slog to get through the 1920s, let me tell you, in the Middle East.
That's right.
But
so next slide, actually.
but one last point. There's a question here. The Afghanistan war started in response to 9/11. Why that country pay the price? What about the Saudis? Sure, we can definitely talk about diplomatic policy towards the Saudis. I think that by and large, they bought off Western acquiescence through oil. And that's been the relationship the Saudis have had since 46 with the United States and the other Western powers.
So let's pull it back. I don't want to glide into because there's a bunch of pieces here I want to get through. So the emergence of, and this is important, this is sort of, I sort of laid some of the groundwork for this, but so there was a set of three camps once the Afghan war was declared, and remember, the Afghan war wasn't just declared by the United States, right? It was declared by lots of different states. So there was devout allies, there was fence sitters, and there was dissenters amongst EU member states, and that, of course, weakened the coherence. And as of 2008, the contribution of Afghanistan was divided into three groups: UK, Netherlands, followed by Germany, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. And then they contributed a significant amount of troops and capacity. Then there was the sort of the fence sitters. And then ultimately there was the dissenters, right? Portugal, Ireland, Greece, France, Finland, and Austria. And what's sort of fascinating about some of these, especially like the French. So obviously the French view has changed on this, but the French have always seen their problem with terrorism is coming directly from sort of MENA, right? Let's say Western Middle East, North Africa. And a lot of that obviously is a reflection of the colonial history and response to it, and the Algerian War, and on and on and on. They in many ways were not prepared for the shift of a more traditionally modern, let's say, Sunni revivalist form of anti-Western terrorist networks that hit France pretty substantially starting into the 2000s and obviously into the 2010s. And they were always sort of they always were in this position of knowing that a lot of the organization and structure of this came from other parts of the region, but they were unable politically to make the commitments that were needed to kind of confront those threats. And so that, and the same with Spain, really, for quite a while.
I was going to say, with France in particular, a
Mhm.
lot of the issue stems from the fact that France has long-term relationships with North African countries. And
Right.
so those
That's exactly
relationships
right.
really informed a lot of the French sentiment
Right.
towards the Islamic world in general. And
That's
it
right.
was sort of an acquiescence as
Yeah.
opposed to an honest assessment of what that relationship should look like.
That's right. That's exactly right. So, as you could tell, if this is what's going on here, these three camps over a course of, more than half a decade, and you're dealing with these events that are happening, right? There's, devastating strikes in Europe, in France and Spain and the UK, Netherlands, Belgium, et cetera. Then you have obviously a challenge. Your local politics generates a challenge. Your commitments that you're willing to have abroad represent a challenge. And then this larger, broader pan-European view around the United States at that point, because of the Iraq War, has its own challenge. And this ultimately, I think, fueled a chunk of the challenges that occurred in Afghanistan. Obviously, not all of them, but a big chunk. And as Richard pointed out, obviously, the allies you had going in were the ones you had, right? And you weren't going to sort of magically flip them in a matter of weeks, months, or a year. And there was, and ultimately, because of the status of Pakistan in the war, the status of the various structures and warlordism that Afghanistan had, and the inability of state capacity to really get developed, and let's say objectively, the lack of commitment, like a South Korea type commitment, post-war type reconstruction for half a century or a quarter century, et cetera, was just not there, and never really was there. And it was never sold to people that is what was needed. I think people intuitively understood that for obvious reasons. You could look at reality on the ground and see that, but nobody ever was willing to be honest enough for that commitment. And then obviously, what happened in Iraq completely poisoned the well. And I think when you mix those together, it was just completely combustible. The next slide. And we'll get further when we get into NATO later, the commitments that you had, assignments across Afghanistan. So, they were pretty substantial by quite a few actors, involving not just military aid, but reconstruction aid, et cetera. But remember, at the end of the day, NATO's missions tend to be somewhat constrained on the humanitarian side, primarily because of the rules for most humanitarian aid organizations force a lot of constraints on how they can work with NATO and NATO capacity to support them. So it's this very gray zone. And I would say the UN, this was another one where the UN missions were pretty paltry for, I would say, for the last 20 years. I mean, compared to the needs. And I think a lot of that just had to do with the combustibility of the regional politics, and the UN not being able to generate the consensus in any real shape or form there. Next slide. Yeah, so let's move on from that one. We'll get into that later. So this is the type of commitment that occurred. So you had, we're talking 35,000, in terms of contributions, from the 2003 in Kabul on. and then basically 2006 to 2010. So these were pretty substantial commitments that Europe had. So, basically they had almost a third of, or 30%, 28%, whatever of the commitment. So, ultimately Europe was sort of indirectly at war in Afghanistan against various actors that were either, counter to the government or building their own parallel government, or, Haqqani network types, or, different Taliban parties. Because I think something people don't realize is that there wasn't one Taliban all the time. There was sort of A, B, and C, and it's almost a collective in some ways, and you could argue it still is. But next slide. So other missions. So it wasn't just Afghanistan. There was other missions going on. So into Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which is what it was called then. So this was part of the Berlin Plus. So this is that, Gumby-like formation that Germany can ply, which was an Operation Concordia to support, the capacity building and security in Macedonia. So you had 13 EU countries, 14 non-EU states, 350 troops, doing 6-month rotation mandates. And then ultimately, once this environment was stabilized, you had European police, EUPOL, that basically took over the mission. So that's a type of missions that the EU states actually are extremely good at doing. I'd say they're as good as anyone in the world at doing. And then the ability to follow on with humanitarian aid and other aid in kind. There's dozens of domains, whether it's education, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's security, everything, right? It's basically state capacity building. In some ways, I think Europe's sort of, a global power in this. They just don't know what they want to do with it in some ways. I mean, they do, like at an operational level, but at like a technical level, but they don't necessarily at a strategic policy level know what they want to do. And a big test is going to be Ukraine, because Ukraine is, likely, even if they're fortunate enough to succeed and maintain their state and somehow at least go back to the pre-war borders, if not something better than that, they're going to have a reconstruction that is astronomical, right? It's going to probably be $500 billion or $1 trillion. It's not just going to be money, right? I mean, it's the amount of capacity they're going to need. They're going to need, tens of thousands, if not, hundreds of thousands of experts for decades to reconstitute, a Ukrainian modern state, basically. So this will be a very, and so far we haven't heard anything about the EU. I mean, it's a whole bunch of grants and loans, and so I assume they're laying some groundwork. They seem to be pretty opaque about this, which I just don't think is great right now. It's not great for the Ukrainians. It's not great for Europe. It's really not great for any actor. Because they can do these things, right? This is the stuff they actually can do. And I would argue they don't need the umbrella of NATO in there, right? They could come in as EU missions. And they do some of that right now in Ukraine, but it's extremely low wattage. It's under the radar. I think they could do a much larger commitment, especially in a truly pure humanitarian, or as it's defined by the EU humanitarian, maybe not defined by the UN humanitarian, but the EU. The next slide.
What was actually the goal of Operation Concordia? Like what was the issue?
So you had at that point in time in Macedonia, you had a very unstable political environment. There's a whole rat hole. You can go down there. And basically, there was a risk of having some, let's say, warlordism kicking into gear. And so it became very important that, in essence, a outside third party could commit enough capacity to unwind those bad actors and helps stand up the government that they had and sustain that government. And that's what Concordia ultimately did. And you had and this is one of the reasons it was spanned across literally every European sort of state, whether they were a member of the EU or not, was to show the commitment to all the parties, basically. So another one of these was, this was sort of a big deal in the Copenhagen EU meeting in 22, or EC meeting in 02. I mean, that the EU was willing to take part in security force operations in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and former republics of Yugoslavia. And then also decided in 04, at the Istanbul summit, that NATO would hand command over the former S4 missions to the EU. So, this was, this proves the point that obviously they can conduct operations when they're committed to doing operations for security, not necessarily military, right? Like, it's a different thing. We're talking not necessarily like expeditionary combat here, right? We're talking about basically peacekeeping, and then peace building, and then capacity building in humanitarian terms, and then ultimately, helping reconcile and construct, the necessary aspects of a functioning state. So 04 was an important opportunity. Turkey was a member of the strategic partnership of EU and NATO that eventually fell apart, of course, when Turkey and the EU sort of got, I don't know, separated with divorce papers not yet filed, something like that. And which is sad, right? Because I actually think Turkey was, and it's another one of these missed opportunities, was an absolutely strategic partner to the EU. And the fact that in some ways, just like the EU did with the US when it came to Afghanistan, they couldn't reconcile the fact that while Turkey, when it comes to larger foreign policy or security dimensions, you can have massive disagreements with, that you still can't reconcile and do lots of functionally valuable things that promote and support European security, which I argue, if they maintain that, you would have seen a different set of responses with Syria, probably with Libya, with migrations. I mean, it had huge knock-on effects, basically, to be honest. Next slide. So this was the Artemis operation. So this was a first off-continent operation, Democratic Republic of Congo, 1,800 troops, most of them French, of course, were sent. That was as the initial group, which was to, in essence, slow down and ultimately stop the fighting and atrocities, and commit to the stabilization, and obviously, again, create the peacekeeping and peace safety environment of the civilian population and IDPs. So this was really you could say, an expeditionary humanitarian mission, which, if you go to the next slide real quick here. Oh, actually, yeah, go back one slide. So this is sort of go back one slide, sorry. So this mission ultimately was a success, and in some ways bred all the other dozen to 24 missions that the EU has had across Africa in the last 20 years. And so I actually see this only expanding. It's going to be very interesting given the Chinese-Russian challenges that exist in Africa. But I think, you know, obviously you always have some missteps and some challenges and some problems and even bad actors. But when it's comparing that to Chinese and Russian actions, for the most part, you know, I'd say generally speaking, the supportive view is that the EU is a better partner when it comes to Africa by, you know, I'd say by a significant amount of the population, and that's been pulled, you know, pretty substantially across Africa for the last, especially the last 10 years. So the last thing we'll go with is sort of the, you know, I kind of call it the seismic event in the last 20 years in modern, especially Western diplomacy, which was the, if you go to the next slide, thanks, which is the US invasion. So, you know, so we talked a few episodes back about how limited Western Europeans were in having independent security defense outside of NATO, and obviously during the Gulf War and the Yugoslav crisis, you know, the Europeans really just couldn't act. They just didn't have the capacity, the willingness, the coordination, the institution. They just didn't have any of it. And so obviously the US invasion of Iraq divided, you know, everybody, and the member states fell into basically two poles, and the whole common, you know, foreign security policy was stressed ultimately. And so former Eastern Bloc and soon to be members of the EU backed the US, which France and Germany obviously didn't. And that really sort of broke the US and Europe in many ways. You've had this sort of triaging that occurred even during President Obama's era. You could say, like, if I'm being objective about it, if the US hadn't invaded Iraq but continued to do what they did in Afghanistan, in some ways, that was a lot of what President Obama's policies were. And not to say that there weren't contributions in NATO and so on. I mean, there were, but there was fundamentally this view that that Europe's modern orientation towards the world is building multilateral peace. It's sort of like a junior UN, and that the US's view was obviously radically different than that, and that the Europeans believed, on the whole, they not everybody obviously, because there were these different camps, needed to divorce themselves from that US view and have their own foreign and security policy and defense policy. And ultimately, they did, but there were obviously repercussions, and some of the repercussions we're seeing are obviously in the invasion of Ukraine, the inability of European states to basically have a cohesive deterrence capability, in essence. If the US was not involved in supporting the Ukrainians, I would argue either the Ukrainians would have collapsed or this would be a Syrian civil war already. And my view is sort of 50-50 of which one it would be. Maybe it would have been both, actually. That's probably realistic. But and so the Europeans I don't know if they recognize this. I don't know if anyone ever recognizes much in life, but I think there's a realization that it's having this ability to work with the US and NATO for large-scale European security is in the interest of Europe, and developing the domestic commitment to that, and the domestic commitment to actually caring about the security of Europe, especially at a large-scale deterrence level, is fundamental to the future stability of Europe. So I think that's the recognition phase that is occurring, or realization phase that's occurring. How that translates into actual policy, I mean, that's what we're going to see this decade, basically.
I was curious if you could give a little bit of color as to why the countries in the Eastern Bloc were so much more pro-US invasion, right? I know, for
Sure.
example, because I've talked with Kwasniewski of Poland, and his argument was basically that the United States stood by Poland during
That's
Poland's
right.
darkest hour, and so it
Exactly
was
right.
Poland's duty to stand by the United States in this darkest hour,
That's exactly
as
right.
opposed to some larger geopolitical objective. Was that the same in other
Yep.
Eastern Bloc
You
countries?
know, for the most part, yes. I mean, for the most part, yes. There was um, a view that, and I do think this is a compare and contrast issue too. That if the European states had been, the Western European states had been more engaged in looking for not supporting the Iraq invasion, but at the same time supporting the Afghan operations, and let's say taking that mission on as a prioritization, I think the Eastern and Central European states would have supported both of those. But given the venom, and I'm not saying it wasn't justified, but the point is given the venom in the politics against it, whereas the U.S. had always supported the independence of those Central and Eastern European states from the Soviets. They all viewed the U.S. as that backbone ally that always supported them, versus, let's say, the Germans or the Austrians or many others that had, let's say, very pliable Cold War politics when it came to things like Poland solidarity movement, the Czech and Hungarian uprisings, and and many others, many smaller ones that don't really prioritize itself in history, sadly. But there were dozens of these, and I'd say for the most part, Europe was not necessarily very supportive of that. So yeah, and so anyways, that's sort of today's presentation, and then where we're gonna leave off, we're gonna actually jump on next time and get into Russia starts entering into the playbook, because you have the invasion of Georgia in 2008, and the South Ossetian let's say annexation and civil war, et cetera, and that starts leading, and then the implementation of Lisbon, and then in some ways the correlation of Russia slowly, in terms of Europeans, very slowly, starting to become a challenge, right? So the bear rising again, and that's a lot of what we'll cover, plus all those missions we talked about. So we'll talk about, and then this regeneration of all these institutions, which are the things they have today, which struggle with Ukraine, but don't struggle in other missions that in some ways they were designed for. So that's a lot of what we're going to focus on the next presentation, and working our way up to, I think some seismic events, the I would say the first Ukrainian war, which history isn't quite calling it that, but I think that's sort of fair to call it. And this is maybe the second Ukrainian war. And so, we're going to really take some big detours in that, because I think the contours of all of that shape so much of the world we're in right now.
So thank you for staying with us for 2 hours. As you formulate your questions, I put in the chat the links to our Meetup, our YouTube, and our PayPal donations. Donations are always appreciated. It costs money to maintain YouTube, Zoom, and Meetup. And if you join our Meetup, you will see all of our upcoming series and developments. If you go to the YouTube page, you can see all of our pre-recorded lectures. In fact, to give you an idea about what's coming down the pike, these are our series that are ongoing. There's, of course, my Middle Eastern History series, which goes on top because I'm just awesome. And that is Thursdays at 7 p.m. There's Greco-Roman Civilization. That's most Saturdays at 12. hosted by Zach, Greg, and Paul. There are 2 philosophy meetups, Asian philosophy on Saturdays and Greco-Roman philosophy on Mondays, both at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Of course, there is our European security meeting that you're at today, right now, and we meet generally Sundays at 2, but we meet once a month. So we'll set up a date probably sometime in early October because I'm going away for most of September. Then there's the Powerful Women series for those of you who want that angle of history. They've talked about the most recent presentation that Jane did was on Catherine the Great of Russia. There's Arms and Armor, which goes on periodically talking about historical clothing and materials that people have used to fight each other throughout history. Dead Languages with John Maloney, Yugoslavian History and Culture and Economy. We just had our first episode yesterday, and we'll probably have a second episode sometime in October. And then, of course, we have our short run series, the Russo-Ukrainian War. We're looking to put on a presentation in the beginning of October that will tabulate all the progress so far. We have 4 prior episodes that show the progress of the Ukrainian War up to about midway through July. There's the Islam 101 series, which will cap off on the 4th of September with my Q&A of Dr. Sabila Ahmad, asking him some more in-depth questions about Islam. And of course, there's the previous, now defunct Crusade series, which we finished, where there are 5 episodes spanning the entire history of the Crusades in the Middle East. And so to return a little bit to the questions, we have one question. Has the official name and contact of Zach's and your groups changed? No, it's just that we separated the History Mostly Ancient meetup for those members who want to be paying contributors. And the New York Museum Food and Travel is for those who want to have access to all of this free material, but not be paid members. There's no difference in tiering. There might be some local events that we're having, like restaurant trips or in-person museum tours, things like that, that we'll do on the History Mostly Ancient and not publicize in the other groups. But in terms of the discourses on the internet, you're getting the exact same material, access to all the same lectures. And so that way you don't have to pay to see what we're doing. There's a question here from Patty. The Western European countries have developed a taste for Russian oligarch bucks, while the Eastern Bloc countries haven't forgotten enough yet. Do you want to comment on sort of this approach to Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I will say this. I think it's a fair representation to say that the Russians, amongst many actors, but the Russians at a substantial level, you know, had a lot of oligarch, you know, let's say, you know, lifestyle and money sort of sloshing around Europe, and that had a, I'd argue it had more of a social and cultural impact than it did, let's say, purely economic. I think London was sort of an exception to that. Maybe Cyprus. I mean, some individual places where they were very focused. Some parts of Greece, Cyprus, Turkey. You know, Turkey wasn't really, you know, obviously part of the EU, UK. But I think the larger, you know, dimension to this is, you know, we've talked for decades about the Chinese having sort of industry national champions, sort of like these superpower companies, these state-owned enterprises. Well, the Russians have that too, and I think we misallocate Russian incompetence in certain things and assume it exists in everything. So the Russian energy super champions are, you know, superpowers economically. And so they have astronomical influence throughout Europe. And so whether it's in, you know, across the whole energy complex, basically. And so I feel that the European co-opting over the decades was far greater than the oligarchs were around the energy complex, which is really state policy at that point. And then, you know, that generated a certain pliability. And then, to be very honest, the Russians were, when I say smart, I don't mean good, but I mean they were intelligent about how they would conduct basically, malicious and malignant type operations, and that they would be these very deniable hybrid, super hybrid, gray zone type activities, which everyone collectively understood was going on. But it took a whole of government to glue it all together, and it was sort of putting your hand in jello to try to stop it. And so you add that complete co-opting of major parts of Europe around the energy complex, the sort of cultural, social sloshing of tons of money in a bunch of different cities, and the cool people set all over Europe. And then you do these sort of gray zone operations, and that was sort of their pre-Ukrainian playbook. And it was pretty effective. I mean, it was actually extremely effective, to be honest. I think Ukraine was their sort of their fundamental change in policy. And I believe they believed, especially with, let's call it Ukraine War 1.0, that didn't change the policy too much. And then I think they felt they could escalate, and the Europeans would just sort of, bend like Gumbies. And that was a, historic miscalculation by the Europeans, even though the Europeans still consume enormous amounts of the energy complex. They're clearly making a commitment, whether it takes 2 years, 4 years, whatever, to wean themselves off of, 50%, 80%, right? An astronomical amount of the Russian energy complex, which the Russians will be able to sell because these are global commodities. But, these will be, this will be a transformation of the Russian energy complex too. Like, that's going to have its own cost, independent of all the sanctions regimes that exist, which are astronomical, right? It's the largest sanctioning of a state in history, basically. You could almost argue they're not calling these things trade embargoes because those have legal definitions, and you could technically say that can be an act of war. But you could argue there's a trade embargo, on Russia and in Europe, even though maybe to fully complete it or to get it to such an exhaustive level might take another year or two. It's a pretty substantial commitment. So that, I think, explains why the oligarchs, and by the way, the oligarchs make great TV, right? Talking about the Russian restructuring of its energy complex into super state-owned enterprises, and then showing how they do special funding and leasing and borrowing agreements, doesn't make for fantastic Netflix TV shows, right? And so showing ostentatious lifestyles and all kinds of sort of Russian money and behaviors all across Europe makes for great TV. So that gets, I think, the majority of the play. And it's relatable to people, right? People, if someone was buying you off with $10 million a year and you were spending it, you could kind of connect yourself to that. But, versus sort of this institutional level, approach.
I would say this is the parallel of what do rich people actually do versus
Yep.
what do you think you would do if you were rich, right?
That's right.
This is the sort of thing. Like, I find that the majority of people who would watch Russian oligarchs buying big yachts around Cyprus and just throwing away money on large scale, you name it, houses, sex lives, whatever. It's exactly what these people would do if they had the kind of money that those individuals had. And the boardrooms of, all right, how are we going to allocate this energy sector in order to increase profits by about 35% over the course of 10 years?
That's right.
15 PowerPoint slides later,
Yep.
slightly lower viewership.
Exactly. And I think this actually reflects an oversimplification, right? Because people think, oh, hey, we're going to shut down these sort of Russian social cultural networks, access to things, and yeah, sure, it'll have an impact. You'll, in tourist towns and in, fancy shopping districts and things like that. But the larger implications are, when you look at the half a dozen, basically the 10 largest energy complex entities that the Russians have, and what we're talking about here is, these are astronomical numbers, right? We're talking, half a quarter to half a $1 trillion a year in, these things are, a Walmart size entity or an Amazon size entity in energy trading, in some cases larger, maybe if you put Walmart and Amazon together. That's how substantial that Russian energy sector is, and its implications in Europe are, over half, 65% of it comes from there, right? In terms of the revenue, and those implications into life in Europe, right? Into, some places like France, it's not going to be as substantial because France has basically energy independence. They're really an exporter, but other states like Germany are 100% dependent, right? Their ability to generate large scale industrial energy is, it's almost non-existent. So, you're going to have a Czech Republic and others, that are extremely, they're all dependent, right? That whole swath of the old, Rhine and Ruhr Valley industrial, super complex is completely dependent on Russian energy for its industrialization. And so that shift is quite substantial. And,
Right.
yeah, the yachts
and as Patty
Mercedes
says, it was easier and cheaper to make policy based on Russian oil than invest in more energy independent infrastructure. And you can code that as a lifestyle choice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the last piece of this was, you could make an argument since, let's say, 2010. I don't agree with the argument, but you can make an argument since 2010 as Europe pursued a more, we'll call it wind and solar only alternative strategy. That fine, that's something that made some sense. But, prior to that, when wind and solar were not scalable yet, or even begun their real journey to become scalable, natural gas and other, energy complexes around nuclear, and really building an inter-European energy network, right? And that will be the byproduct of this. And this is going to take a very long time. And we'll talk about that at some later date when I'll pivot from defense and security to things like different topics like energy and on and on and on. But so Europe does not have an interconnected grid for energy sharing. It has little subgrids, but the whole grid isn't connected together. So there's an incredible inefficiency with that. And also it means individual states have to construct very challenging energy arrangements with different states and different regions. And so to me, that is one of those big elephants in the room that the Europeans are going to have to confront. And a big problem with it is that it's viewed as sort of negative to use legacy energy assets in Europe, period, like socially, politically, culturally. So that has held that back. And that's the fight that they have right now is, okay, well, we're not going to have enough wind and solar for 30 years. So what do we do between now and 30 years? And the answer is not legacy energy. And so then it's frozen. Like that's this frozen conflict in energy politics in Europe right now. Because if you're connecting the grid together, you're connecting it to talk to legacy energy assets for the most part. Some, new alternatives, but most of it is legacy energy, 90+% of it. And over time, that would go up. So, all right.
So considering we have no further questions, I think this is actually a good time to break off. Always a pleasure. Thank you guys so much for the kind words. Yeah, so we'll see everybody next month or early October when we have our next episode.
Sounds great. Look forward.
All right.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Thanks, Patty. Bye-bye.